new season.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the first event in the fall 2021, winter 2022 iteration of the Popular Music Books and Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbard and Carl Wilson. Next week, on September 27th, Catherine Provenzano and Mike Derrico will be here to talk about software studies and music production. And in case you're unaware, you can find the full 2021-2022 schedule for Popular Music Books and Process events on the IASPM US website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, as well as previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have Joshua Clover here to talk about Roadrunner, the first book in the new Duke University Press singles series. And he will be in conversation with Elizabeth Nelson and Eric Weisbard. Joshua Clover is the author of 7 books, including the forthcoming Roadrunner, as well as Riot, Strike, Riot, The New Era of Uprisings, a political economy of social movements, with recent editions in French, German, Turkish, and Swedish. A former journalist with The Village Voice, The Nation, Spin, and others, he's currently professor of English and comparative literature at University of California, Davis, as well as affiliated professor of literature and modern culture at the University of Copenhagen. Elizabeth Nelson is a singer-songwriter for the Washington, D.C.-based garage punk band, The Paranoid Style, a civil servant in the field of education policy, and a regular contributor to The Ringer, Oxford American, the New York Times Magazine, and Pitchfork, amongst others. In 2020, Spin Magazine ranked The Paranoid Style the 27th best rock and roll band currently working, thereby adding 26 names to her renowned enemies list. Eric Weisbard co-organizes Popular Music Books and Process, is professor of American Studies at University of Alabama, author of Songbooks and Top 40 Democracy, among other books, and former POP conference organizer, Journal of Popular Music Studies co-editor, Village Voice music editor, and WPRG music director. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Carl will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Carl will find them there at the end of the discussion. And also feel free to post comments throughout the conversation. So I will now turn things over to Joshua, Elizabeth, and Eric.
Thank you. I think I'll just get off and running, and we'll move into it. By way of thanking some people, I hope it'll be okay if I just read a passage from the acknowledgements of the section of the book. This book began as a 20-minute talk that would later be published in Best American Music Writing. I'm grateful to the editors, Griel Marcus and Daphne Carr. That talk was first presented at the annual POP conference in Seattle, and much of my gratitude lies there, starting with Ann Powers and Eric Weisbard, both for their efforts on behalf of the music writing world and for their longtime kindness to me. Over the years, I've met many people at the conference who have challenged and changed my thinking, including my brilliant co-editor for the series, Emily Lordy. I met Ken Whisker at the very first PopCon, and we argued about Adorno at Eric and Ann's house. I forget who took what position. He was probably right, so it goes. To that list, I should add Carl and Kim. Thank you for inviting me to this event, and also Eric again and Elizabeth for grilling me today. And thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see you all, some old friends, Franklin, Jennifer, various other people, Ian, and then a bunch of people I don't know. So this is really great. So I'm going to leap right into it. The book begins and ends literally and figuratively with the song Roadrunner, with Jonathan driving around the ring road, faster miles an hour in the famous phrase. And a number of people here will recall either the original talk or its published version. So they will more or less know the argument wherein I take that image of circulation coordinated with some songs that I think are versions of Roadrunner to offer an account of something like history from 1972 to around 2008. From the local to the global, the circulation of songs and sounds, the circulation of humans, that is planetary migration, the circulation of imperialism and struggles against it, the circulation of finance and eventually a financial crisis, inevitably described in the language of contagion. And I also deal with the circulation of contagion itself. There's a pandemic aspect to the book, which was written before the current pandemic, although revised accordingly. So given this all sort of in play, I'm going to tack away from that. And before reading a passage or two from the book, offer 10 minutes on myth instead. That's the book's other and inner argument, developed in the Chuck Berry chapter and then in the last chapter when I circle back to Jonathan. I should explain there's a Chuck Berry chapter for a number of reasons, but mostly because one of the striking things about Roadrunner, I really think this is odd, is that we never find out in a song that's based on ceaseless enumeration and proper names, we never find out what songs are on the radio. But he drives past the spirit of 1956, patient in the bushes next to 57, in another famous line. And I think there are various reasons to speculate that he's listening to Chuck. That brings us back to foundations. Chris Gow thinks Maybelline utterly changed pop music, and I don't disagree. Anyway, I do my best to re-narrate something like the founding myth of rock and roll, which I sometimes call the story. And it goes something like this. It's about freedom. I know that is impossibly corny, but I hope you'll stay with me out of generosity alone. I think Roadrunner is worth a book because it's the truest telling of this story, this myth. The song is so minimal because it is really committed to refining this inner nature down to its essence. With its 2 or 3 chords and nowhere to go, that is to say, its utter constraint, Roadrunner is the freest song I know. Anything could happen next and doesn't. That's one contradiction. Here's another. It's such an extraordinary song because of its absolute commitment to the ordinary. This is a version of what I think Greel meant when he described the song as, quote, the most obvious song in the world and the strangest. There are 10,000 freedoms, but rock freedom is definitely set in the first instance in a car when it's laid outside. It can be ecstatic, it can be boring, it can be adjectiveless freedom, but you have reached escape velocity, faster miles an hour, you have no particular place to go, and you have the radio on. If you did have a particular place to go, that is to say, if you are not free, where would it be? That may seem impossible to answer, but in some sense, I think it's obvious. It's important to remember that rock and roll is truly an invention of massive industrial growth, maybe the last great invention of industrialism. That provides the key. You are free at the wheel of your automobile because of a complementary unfreedom, which is to simplify the person working in the auto factory. When you buy the car, you are purchasing their misery. And the important thing is the driver and the factory worker, one circulating through the world of consumption with its pop songs and its stop and shops, one immobilized in the world of production with its assembly line. These are not different people, despite what they tell you in Econ 101. They're the same person. It's just a different time of day. Even if you're not literally an auto worker, this relationship, right, this contradiction is still 100% in place. You're still part of that vast class of humans that has to labor to buy back the very things it produces at a premium. The spectral freedom of the highway is inevitably purchased with your own unfreedom. The ring road always turns away from the factory, from this truth. And because it's a ring road, it always turns back toward it too. Well, that's a fucking bummer. How then can rock be about freedom? Okay, I will admit that was sort of a ruse. Myths aren't about stuff. They do stuff. They don't exist to tell the truth, and they don't exist to lie. They exist to resolve contradictions in songs and stories that can't be resolved in actuality, in daily life. Rock and roll is not about freedom. It's the impossible and maybe utopian effort to feel that illusory freedom, which is to say, rock is the suppression of that awful knowledge that freedom in this world is always also unfreedom. That's a real contradiction. Not just two opposed things, but two opposed things that are fused together, that sustain each other even as they're absolutely contrary. Rock, I think, is the desperate, venal, doomed, heroic, kind of fucked up, raced and gendered fantasy that you can drive your car so fast that you can detach one world from the other, detach the ring road from the assembly line and just be free. Only then can a car ride become a joyride. You need a car, you need a highway because you need escape velocity, you need the radio on for a dozen reasons, because you love music, because rock has to be present in order to do its trick, because the driver is always a proxy for the listener, and so must be a listener in turn. But most of all, and I mean this only somewhat allegorically, you need the radio on to drown out the factory bell. I'm going to take that bell as a call to read just a little bit from the book, about 8 minutes more. I'm not going to read a single passage. Instead, as a bit, I'm just going to read some random sentences from across the Chuck Berry chapter, since that is material I've never shared with this bunch or anyone until this book, and then a few paragraphs from the closing chapter near the end. Okay, so what you hear henceforth is from the book. While the Stones busied themselves with admiring covers, Berry released No Particular Place to Go, a single that opens with another quick guitar riff, this one more like a chime. Dated 1964, the song is possessed by the spirit of 1957, quite literally. It's music recycled from that year's school days. In the original, Berry gives the opening chime its narrative sense by singing "Ring, ring goes the bell," a phrase that is eventually arrives at its opposite pole, "Hail, hail, rock and roll." Now a different passage. Sure, school is a kind of factory. That's sort of Berry's point with the "ring, ring goes the bell." But this is what must in general be concealed for the romance of the teenager to blossom. You have a driver's license, but no time card, not yet. And that is everything. Physical speed, but not the dreary commute. The teenager is the person not yet divided into two parts. The teenager accords with rock and roll's fantasy. There must be a car, but it must be forever in the realm of consumption, driving around and around. It takes a fast car, lady, sang the Cars in 1979, to lead a double life. But they are mistaken. All adults lead a double life. No car is fast enough either to draw the two together or to split them apart. It takes a fast car, maybe, to lead a single life. That's why teenagers are the ones riding around for joy, to quote Delta 88 from 1951. Another passage. Much of the writing about Johnny B. Good attends to its singular character, how it is the single rock song that we shot into space, how according to an unsigned Rolling Stone entry, it is, quote, the first rock and roll hit about rock and roll stardom, how it is Berry's autobiographical moment, albeit with country boy, per the author, swapped in for the first draft's colored boy, how it features the eloquent description of Johnny's natural gift, how he could play the guitar just like ringing a bell. Less commonly mentioned is how that bell is also mentioned near the opening of this chapter, persists across Berry's work, is a Berry cliche. It eventually arrives at Berry's novelty cover, My Ding-a-ling, with its silver bells hanging on a string, but it's there from the outset. Ring, ring goes the bell. Berry is forever calling us to order so that order can be tested against rock music. The bell is a prolonged summoning we can hear across the span of a career. Wake up, come here, listen to this. You hear his bell and start salivating for rock and roll. Has there ever been a more Pavlovian artist? The chapter near the end, there's a sort of punchline where I suggest that Johnny B. Good's middle name is in fact Bell. And then I point out that it being present from the very beginning, not just of Berry, but of rock and roll hiding in plain sight right there in the middle syllable of Maybelline. It's magic, right? So from that note, let me leap into the final chapter and read a slightly longer passage about Roadrunner, and then we'll open it up to conversation. While it may not immediately appear so, it is the very same problem that we encountered first in Chuck Berry, a problem, that is to say, entangled with the birth of the genre. This is the division that appears at first in the commonplaces of cultural lore to map directly onto that between teen and adult, innocence and experience, country boy and city lights, but is finally something else, intimately related, absolutely distinct, the fantastical separation of no particular place to go from the call to order. the division of the ring road from ring ring goes the bell. Rock and roll is premised on the separation of the joyride from the factory. In lingering with a 4-minute song about driving around at night listening to the radio, this may seem an arbitrary and abstruse place to end. And yet, that is where the song begins, in this exact separation. Jonathan is flying into the world and he recognizes his situation. That is what revelation is, after all. It's just recognition accelerated to faster miles an hour. Though he's not much of a singer, he begins to sing. He sings the world of commodities and their remnants, the entire set of sublunary things that will provision Roadrunner. But like all recognitions, this one is two-sided. And even while flying into it, he begins to withdraw. Not from the beauty, not from the unity, but from the accompanying leap. He encounters before him the made world, but the made world without its makers, just Jonathan and a road, a suburb, a state, a civilization spread out beneath the moonlight in which he might endlessly list the built, the fabricated, the pre-recorded, the artifacts of an otherwise absent race that spangle the landscape through which he rides, the only person alive, until that startling turn 3 minutes into twice when he politely requests, okay, now you say it, modern lovers. And we discover with a start that he's not alone in the car. And they sing Radio On to start the call and response outro, but it is already too late. Already the other side of the ecstasy that has been thrown into stark relief, what it means and what it entails. He does not want to stop being a teenager in love with the modern world and disappear into the radio, disappear into work and professionalism, disappear into production. And is that not the utopian problem of the story? The leap that it contemplates, thematizes, sustains, is the moment in which the separation is overcome, and the unity that feels holy is revealed as the simple truth that someone works at the Stop and Shops and the factories, someone works at the recording studios and at the record stores, all different, all the same. If he makes the leap, then he will slot in there somewhere. The utopian problem is not how to slot in the right place as the rock and roll star, but how not to disappear. From this, everything follows. He is the most amateur of amateurs. Every break and withdrawal was to preserve some fraction of this. He blew up the contract to stay an amateur. Even after he started recording the record, he blew up the band, started over and over, ended over and over. He did whatever he could to stay adjacent to the radio without ever quite disappearing into it. Maybe someday his name would be in lights. Nah, maybe not. All right, I'll rest with that. I will thank you for your patience in listening and submit to whatever Elizabeth and Eric have in mind.
Elizabeth, would you like to start the grilling, or do you want to go straight into rock crit mode and make it grilling? I don't know.
Oh, no, I do not want to grill, but I would like to go first, if that's okay.
Totally.
So first of all, Joshua, congratulations on the book, and thank you everyone for inviting me to do this. I'm so glad that I have distinguished myself by showing up late. But my first question for you is that I've been a fan of Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers for decades, and I have tried and failed to finally come to a place of peace in understanding Jonathan Richman's relationship to irony. He seems self-aware, but he's frequently guileless, almost as a matter of principle. And I feel like you can distill large swaths of the Modern Lovers material as a sort of rejoinder to Joni Mitchell. Like, she says they paved over paradise and put over in a parking lot, and they're like, yes. So in the book, you describe Roadrunner as an anti-irony campaign. And I'd love to hear you expand on this idea. And I'm also just curious to know what you hear when you listen back to the Modern Lovers material. Is it a postmodern kind of irony, or is Richman just a dyed-in-the-wool descendant of Eisenhower era ethos who just happens to love the Velvet Underground?
This is already too hard. Yeah, wow, that's an amazing question. And in part, I mean, I find that really hard for a lot of reasons. One, I'm with you, like with the irony of all the, I don't know, is that one of the affects? I don't know. But irony is one of the hardest things to track and one of the hardest things to agree on. And many people can listen to the same thing and just have strong disagreements. And whether some things are obviously ironic, right? And some things are maybe obviously not, although is that even possible? Which is to say, is irony a historical condition that people experience rather than something implicit in the music? There'd be some amazing question, to see over the course of responses to Roadrunner, by which, there's a decent library of writing about Roadrunner now. Whether there's been a change in whether people hear it ironically or not. I guess to make the obvious point, there's at least two different kinds of irony. There's like the O. Henry irony, where someone buys the comb and someone sells their hair and buys the watch fob, and right. So that's one version of irony that's definitely not narratively present in Jonathan Richman. And then there's a version of irony where people say, like, have a nice day, and they say it in a way so they don't really mean it, right? So it's the kind of utterance that's the particular formal way that it's presented lets you know that it has a different meaning. So that's the question, right? Sorry, now I've just like fucked around so I could clarify for myself what I can sort of get to in the question, which is the formal way that Jonathan and the Modern Lovers present the music, the songs, such that it's supposed to transform the meaning, or is the meaning supposed to be in some sense direct or immediate, although we all know there's no such thing because we're all very sophisticated people, blah, blah, blah. And I really don't know. I really don't think that the form ironizes itself. There's clearly a great sense of self-awareness, right? It's a song about listening to songs. It's thus already like whatever meta-artistic, and in that sense, formally ironic, right? It's about music and it knows it's music, and it. But I think that refusal to want to be that refusal to really occupy the place and be like, I'm the musician. I'm a big fan, to shout out to Eric for a second, I'm a big fan of the first several years of Guns N' Roses, right? But everything about Axl was wanting to occupy that position, every single thing. Even the bullshit, like, what's the greatest thing about Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers? You can love them forever and you'll never have to hear the fucking album about what a pain it is to be a star and how you can't leave your house and blah, 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 blah. Like, you literally never have to hear that. And that's great, right? And that's the non-ironic part for me. I think it's impossible not to hear irony in it because it's got that self-awareness, and it's always going to be at a distance. We're at a distance from that experience, and when we project ourselves into the car late at night, by projecting away from ourselves, we become at a distance from ourselves. So we're always going to encounter irony, but I just don't think he's an ironic dude. I've never hung out with him, and went through great pains to try and not care about that, because obviously he's a person who doesn't want his biography told and doesn't want that kind of treatment. And I wanted to honor that. But I just don't think he's an ironic dude. The few times I've seen him in concert, he looks to me like, like a 50, I don't know how old he is now. I'm trying to think about the last time I saw him, but like a 50-year-old who's baffled that he could be 50 because he still feels like a teenager. Boy, I feel that. And at the same time, right, like as hopelessly naive and teenish as he is, he speaks at least 4 languages. He's super, like knowledgeable and thoughtful and well-informed. So that's a complicated break. Is that break ironic? I don't know. It's a tough one. Maybe I just hate irony and hate David Foster Wallace, and I'm working through my emotions right now. Thank you for the question.
Did you want to ask a follow-up, Elizabeth, or?
No, I'm very satisfied with that, and I didn't mean to turn your head around too hard on that one. So Eric, if you want to hit up next, that'd be great.
I think before I get into my sort of prosaic comment, not questions, I should invite Joshua to talk about the other part of his book that isn't 1,000% clear yet from what we've heard. And Joshua, can you talk a little bit about how in this book, you're at least as concerned to move the story of Roadrunner forward and to not just inhabit the spirit of 1956 Patient in the Bushes next to 57, but the spirit of 1972 Impatient in the oil crisis next to 73, and all the way through to at least the housing crisis of 2008. In other words, on one level, this book seems to be an attempt to reposition the rock and roll single, but it's not only in that sort of American Graffiti 1973 looking back on history way. It's very much also a 21st century book. So I think you should talk a little bit about that. Is that a problem? I can go to the more challenging questions if you want. You wrote those parts. I think you got this.
I don't know how much more. I mean, it's challenging in the sense that it's a big question that I can talk, I know the hour-long answer for it, but I don't want to burden anyone here with it. And I'm trying to figure out how to do a quick summary. So yeah, a quick version of the historic argument goes like this. I think the really best historians of the world, sort of big scope, long durée historians, have an account in which the US, whatever you want to call it, empire, it's not the worst term, peaks around 1973. This is a very consistent story. There's lots of specific reasons you can date it to that, although I don't want to be simple about what's cause and what's effect. And you can name many things. The oil shock was a big thing. Of course, we have right around that time, we have the formal departure from Vietnam, and the US recognition that it will henceforth be a loser of every war it enters into, rather than a winner. But mainly we have what gets called, I think mainly, what gets called deindustrialization, which is a transformation both of American power, because it means America is generating a lot less wealth overall, although it's certainly being recirculated faster and faster, but it's not generating as much wealth as it was at all. And that also transforms how people work every day, right? How they live, what kinds of jobs they do, if they have jobs at all, and so on. So I think that's a real transformation that happens right around the time that Roadrunner comes out. So Roadrunner turns out to be a really convenient, convenient feels cheap, right? But high functioning way to narrate that pivot, because what's the period of America's growth all about? Industrial power, right? And industrial power is always figured by what? The car, the assembly line, Fordism, the production, the car, from the Model T all the way forward. And so there we have Jonathan, there we have exactly the right historical moment of this great transformation. There we have the car. But what's coming is the post-industrial period, right? Where it's not about production, it's about, circulation, which is a technical term from political economy that I try and make less technical over the course of the book. But it's going to be about that. America is going to do a lot of circulating of wealth. After all, that's what Facebook is, among other things, and Google and so on, but not a lot of producing of wealth. And that figure of circulation is going to explain a whole lot. So I think that the place we end up in, the present, is the consequence of the circulation era of the US empire in many, many different ways. And I think that image of circulation really propagates. So I try and track a bunch of songs that A, I think are versions of Roadrunner, but B, non-coincidentally, are obsessed with the question of circulation. So there's a chapter about Brimful of Asha by Cornershop, which, I give myself a small pat on the back. I figured this out before Chinder Singh admitted that he thought of it as a cover of Roadrunner. That, the chanting of 45 that goes on for that long outro, where he says 45 and then something, proper name, 45, proper name, 45, proper name, is a version of Radio On, proper name, Radio On, proper name. And this is especially evident in the Fatboy Slim remix, the long version, which is amazing. I guess he did that remix under the name Norman Cook. And of course that song is an endless version of Circulation. The video, if you look at it, starts with the image of a girl over a 45 player and the record circulating, which is of course our primary image of Circulation, but it's inevitably about like cultural circulation, right? Because the stuff that gets listed off is all about like brands that come from India and make it to the UK and vice versa. And all the circulation, particularly between Southeast Asia and the West, especially the UK. And then there's the chapter on, leap forward into that internationalism. There's a chapter on MIA. MIA is relentlessly, she's more about circulation than any artist that's ever existed and ever will exist. It's literally all she's ever thought about from the very beginning of like driving around London and Galang. Right, that's all about also about driving around in a circle, but also like listing off all the places in the globe, and every song is about that, right? She has that song Bird Flu, what's Contagion about, but circulation, right? The circulation of contagion. I read Paper Planes as being about, among other things, about financial, like it's the vision of a dollar bill flying around, right? Think about the video happily tells us things. The image of like dollar bills just flying through space. Circulating on, but most importantly, there's that song Bamboo Banga, which if you haven't listened to, I will just tell you right now, there's just hasn't been a better song made this millennium. I have a list on my computer if you want to hear the best songs of the top 25 songs of all time. I can give you a quick reference. But and it begins, as many of you will know, with the really uncanny summoning phrase, Roadrunner, Roadrunner, going 100 miles an hour, and that dialing down from faster miles an hour to 100 miles. And there's something really brilliant about that. It's still really fucking fast, but it's a weird also kind of dialing down of expectations, a kind of specification and diminishment that's trying to articulate something about the shift from the ring road outside Boston, Route 128, to driving around in civil war torn Sri Lanka. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about Sri Lanka. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about Duran Duran in that song. If you're a Duran Duran fan, it's one of the most interesting fan relationship songs around. So I just try and tell about history of sort of the decline of America, which I tell with great relish because I fucking hate America. And it can't decline fast enough as far as I'm concerned. And I realize its decline causes real pain and misery for real humans. And I don't want to I don't want to obscure that. That said, it's obvious that the American empire has to go, right? It's trivially obvious that that has to go, and it has to happen fast for anything to survive in the world. So I try and narrate that decline with as much run-on sentence enthusiasm as Roadrunner narrates its own circulation.
Fantastic. See, I knew you could do that.
I like that version. Thank you for asking. I wish I could, there's a recording. Okay, I might say that.
Elizabeth?
Okay. Well, with all of that in mind, I have a question that I think maybe will dovetail with what Eric was asking you and what you were just speaking about. And I don't want to make this a massive downer of a conversation about the American experiment and all of its failures. But it seems to me like the through line between Roadrunner and Bobby Troupe's Get Your Kicks on Route 66 is that's the sort of nexus, but there's, and I can't come up with a better word right now, but there's a central irony because Route 66, which stretched from Chicago to Los Angeles and allowed for passage through the Southwest United States, represented this sort of finalizing of American westward expansion, but was ultimately made obsolete by the same Interstate Highway Act of 1956 that brought into existence the highways that were traveled by Richman in Roadrunner. And so I was wondering, since you do talk about this in the book, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 and what ways it transformed America and the American landscape for better or for worse.
Oh man, another topic I love. I could talk about the Federal Aid Highway Act for like forever. I'm sure all of you encountered it at some point in your lives, like the fact of its existence, the fact that Eisenhower was behind it. One of the stories is that Eisenhower, having, as you know, served in the military for quite some time, fairly early in his military career was stationed in Europe and saw their system for transporting troops in various places, and brought back that idea, or that thought of like importance to national security of having a massive federal highway system. And some think of that as the backstory to it. And I'm going to challenge that in a second, or trouble it, or whatever we say, whatever the proper critical term is, scuff it up a little. But one of the important things about the Federal Highway Act, which is 56, 57, so it's literally the peak of American growth, which is probably the peak of historical economic growth in the history of the world, right? It's really the height of expansion. The profit rate is as high as it's ever been. There's a sense you can have big public projects. And since we're in the middle of a big infrastructure discussion right now in our present world, I will note that if you, in adjusted dollars, the Federal Aid Highway Act is the most expensive infrastructure project in the history of the United States, the biggest ever. And so that Eisenhower story about how it's secretly or not so secretly for making sure troops can move around, people love that story, right? That's a story people love because they feel knowledgeable about it. They tell it over and over again, right? It's always the big story about the remaking of Paris in the 19th century, that Haussmann widens the boulevards and knocks down the popular neighborhoods. There's a lot of discussion of popular neighborhoods in the book, by the way. Knocks down the popular neighborhoods so that the military can move freely and get around quickly to crush, because Paris, there's endless uprisings and barricade wars, and that's the story. And it's just not a great story. It's maybe true in a secondary sense, but for example, the art historian T.J. Clark, who's one of the people I learned to write prose from, among other things, a great art historian, but a greater writer, if you ask me, just a beautiful writer. He has a very clear account about how the widening of the boulevards was necessary to promote shopping, right? To open up the first department stores in the history of the world, right, in Paris, and to allow commerce, to allow the delivery. There's this new era of accelerated, which are just entering into the era of industrialization. And there's this new era of accelerated commodity production. It has to be moved around quickly, delivered quickly. Shoppers have to be able to move with ease. That's probably a better story about the redesign of Paris. And it's surely a better story about the Federal Aid highway system, right? Which is, it may have military purposes, but its main function is to make sure that the new intensification of production of commodities can circulate really well and efficiently. The trucking industry, which, as you perhaps know, is at the present the largest single category of employment in the United States, is in trucking. So right at the peak of industrialization, which I'm going to keep using the code production, right? They build this thing which is for circulation, which is specifically for circulation, and not just circulation of like get your kicks on Route 66, right? That's hijacking for your own purposes. But the goal of the federal highway system is to let truckers deliver commodities, perishable, non-perishable, as fast as possible, which is the beginning of the circulation story, right? Because that's the circulation side. First, you produce a commodity, and then you have to move it around and get it to a place where you can sell it, and people have to be able to get to where you buy it and get it home. That's all circulation and consumption. So that's the story of the so I think Route 66 is interesting, the song and the route itself, because it has less of that vibe. It comes into being less explicitly as this sort of servant of an attempt to accelerate consumption in that particular way. That's maybe where Route 66 feels a little bit more fun, or something like that. But the federal highway is for trucking, which is interesting, right? As we all know, they pretend to be frantically working on self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles. Is that what they call them? And it mostly seems like it's Tesla and Apple's gonna have a car and whatever. And that's just a sideshow. Obviously, the technology they're looking for is self-driving trucks that can do this delivery work, speed up circulation without having to worry about employment. And that's the story, right? More and more circulation, less and less employment, and less power for labor to do anything about it. Because, you know, truckers have actually a lot of power. If you ever lived in Mexico and seen truckers shut down the nation, which they're really good at doing, it's amazing. But once we get self-driving trucks, don't have to worry about that. I hope that begins to answer Elizabeth's question. It's a great question.
All right, I'm going to ask one more little quick round of questions, and then I think we should turn it over to the foaming at the mouth, not to mention the chat, foaming at the chat, audience. These are meant to be questions that can be answered a little quick because they're a cluster, and they're sort of roads not taken questions. So first one is 56 next to 57 could also evoke Elvis Presley into that other Jack from Lowell, Massachusetts, Kerouac on the road. And so I'm curious about the relationship of highways, literature, song, where the beats are concerned.
Do you want to keep on asking a question?
No. Let's start with that one. Again, I'll just ask a couple very quick ones. I mean, that are meant to be quick answers because I know they're not your main focus, but just they must be things that you thought about at least a little bit. So I'm just curious to know where they slot for you as you think about this sort of Cloverian cosmology.
Eric is, I think, very generously about to ask me a cluster of questions about stuff I don't like. So I can say I hate that. Like the beats I hate. There's a couple great poets. I think Allen Ginsberg from 1953 to 1967 is a great poet. But mostly I think the beats are terrible. Like I was a teenager too, and my friends said, you got to read this book. And I was like, what the fuck? I read, you know, On the Road when I was the right age to read it. And I thought it was terrible, and still do. And I'm not a fan of any of that prose. And so I tried not to, I just like let it lie. You could absolutely tell that story. And you know, it's true, it's not that far from where Jonathan is driving, especially if you listen to Roadrunner thrice, where he widens the range of the drive a little bit that he narrates. He gets pretty close to Jack Kerouac's grave. And you know, I'd like to imagine there's a version where there's some connection there or encounter between Jonathan and Kerouac. But I think I like to think that Jonathan Richman, about whom I have a very romanticized opinion, would not think highly of Kerouac. And to boot, never liked Elvis. Always thought he was terrible. Didn't get it. Every now and then I have that experience, right, where you read someone super smart. Greel's one example, but not the only one. You read them about Elvis, and you're like, wow, there's a lot there. And you go back and you listen to Elvis, and you're like, this is terrible. All right,
good enough. Let me go on. Let me go on to number two. And I'll throw in there as another unmentioned Rabbit in the first Updike novel, driving and listening to music to get away from a woman. And so that's one ignored cluster. Another is engaged, but I want to ask you a little bit about how you engage it. And that's top 40, which seems to me to be emerging with that highway system as a format across the country at more or less the same moment. And as I understand top 40, it's less about what song is Jonathan Richman listening to in Roadrunner, but more about the notion of what top 40 stations promise listeners, which is you already know what you're going to hear before you turn on the radio, even though you don't know which song it's going to be. So is there a way in which top 40, with its DJs, its callers in, its stream of songs, is an active force in Roadrunner, which is recorded at a moment when most listeners are turning to FM radio?
Yeah. Again, I mean, you act like these are like small questions, and right, I mean, some of us, I'm not naming names, may have written extremely brilliant extended books about American top 40. I'll also note that the very first PopCon, my first paper, which is also the first chapter I ever had published in a book in my life, thank you everyone who participated, was about the arrival of the top 40 and the unification of the American music market, which doesn't actually quite happen in 56, 57. I really think the US charts aren't unified and coherent until around 62, which is the year that American Graffiti is set. But the role of top 40 is interesting, right? Because I mean, we don't have quite the same account of it. I actually think the top 40 is almost, you say, you know what you're going to hear, and like, sure, inarguable. I also think it's far more heterogeneous than college radio, as it happens. College radio is just like, look, everyone has a tattoo. They're all so different. But you know, he's very pointed. He says, I got the AM, right? The things that he shouts over the course of the song, you know, there's many versions of the song live, many studio versions, lots of things change. I got the AM doesn't change. He's really committed to that. So I think, and there's a lot about this in the book, and so I mean, it's a short book. There's not a lot about anything, I'll be honest with you, but it returns repeatedly to the question of when the car radio starts to appear. And how that's a necessary category for rock and roll. Rock and roll doesn't need a radio, it needs a car radio, and needs a relatively high quality car radio, not just for rock and roll to market itself through the radio, but for people to imagine the situation, which, as I suggested, requires a fast car and requires radio on. And so I think top 40 is utterly foundational, right? But top 40 into the song, to Roadrunner. I think Roadrunner doesn't exist without it. And it almost exists generically, right? Because he never says song, but he does say, I got the AM, and it clearly means he's got like junky music, which depending on the year, who knows? The year, you know, at the time that he was recording Roadrunner, the dominant AM song was The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face by Roberta Flack, a song originally written in, wait for it, 1957, re-recorded by various people, recorded in 1968 by Roberta Flack, but then it appears in Play Misty for Me, right? Which is a movie about what? A DJ. And with that movie, it hits big and is the top song in the country for a prolonged period of time, wins the Grammy for 72 during the period when so that's all there for me. I think top 40 as a spirit is central to the song. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, and I'll throw in that I think top 40 also resists the divide you're talking about by trying to both be a consumer product and a consumer product that sells speed and quick and a sense of liberation. Okay, third one, moving away from top 40. Yeah.
Can I just jump in and ask a quick question about highways and songs?
Oh, yeah, please. Sorry.
Just really, really quickly, Joshua. I'm so sorry, and I'm so sorry to all of the fans who want their questions answered. I just really, in listening to you guys talk about this, I was thinking about Springsteen and Born to Run. Nice. And I'm sorry if that was your question and I'm jumping on it, but I just sort of wondering, like, in comparing the two songs, for Springsteen, the highway sort of represents possibility. It's getting away from yourself, possibly creating a new identity for however short of a time, whereas Richman's version of the highway is it's a circle and it starts and ends in the same place. And I'm wondering if you have a perspective on, and I hate this word, but which is the more authentic representation of America and which one is the more optimistic?
Wow, authenticity and irony. Elizabeth really bringing it. So there's actually, interestingly, was a discourse about Springsteen in the book that I cut for length. The length of this series is very fixed. Ken is here somewhere, and he was not going to let anyone go over length. I cut a Bruce Springsteen passage. So Born to Run is like, it's mentioned briefly, right? There's like one sentence about it in the book, but there could have been a chapter for sure. And this isn't going to quite answer your question, right? But Bruce Springsteen is clearly, I have mixed feelings about him, but he's clearly, I think exception is the wrong word, but doesn't fit my schema in that if rock and roll suppresses the fact of miserable wage labor so that you can imagine freedom, Bruce Springsteen is one of the few rock stars who insistently comes back to wage labor over and over again. In fact, if you look Wikipedia under proletarian poetry, the entry is almost entirely about Bruce Springsteen, hilariously enough. And, so I think, and this is again, not quite an answer to your question, but maybe it is, I think Born to Run, a song I don't like much, but I think it's explicitly about, what are you running from? The wage. I think it's the same song as Roadrunner, right? Like, we're gonna have to be strapped across this engine. We're gonna drive so fast, we're gonna get away from the wage, right? And that's it. And by the time we get to the river, he knows better. There's no way out. You just go back to the river. There's no, but I absolutely think that song is about the same fucking thing. But he has a different relationship to it, and a more knowing one, right? A more knowing one, a more explicit one, which you can choose how you feel about that.
My final point's already been asked in the chat. So Carl, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. So the first in on the chat in grand PMBiP tradition was Anne, who then had 3 or 4 questions come up along the way. So maybe you want to pick one and do that.
Do you have one you like, Carl?
I thought well, no, they were all good, but I mean, maybe your last one was, maybe your climate question was.
Okay, yeah, I'll ask that one. Somebody else asked that Chuck Berry question though, but Jody maybe. But so I was wondering, Joshua, what happens to Roadrunner in relation to climate crisis, and what happens to the freedom feeling of rock and roll in the moment of climate crisis, but specifically, like, how does the circulation change? How does the mythos of freedom change when we know every time we go faster miles an hour, we are destroying the earth? And I mean, obviously, we were destroying the earth in the 70s and the 50s also, but now with a greater knowledge of that, I wondered if that changes things at all.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Sorry to be here.
I mean, it changes things retrospectively. The good news is rock is dead. There's literally no more rock. There hasn't been any rock since, I'm checking now, right now, 1995. And everything since then is, and here I'm being technical, a hoax. And so rock, which is absolutely about, I mean, even if it's not explicitly about a car, as I've suggested, it's absolutely an emanation of industrialization. And we know what industrialization is, right? The most recent IPCC 6 report, not to really dwell on bad shit, but their technology for figuring out the history, going back and figuring out climate change data is really getting much better. And now they're very clear. The period that we're talking about of anthropogenic disaster begins in 1750. It fucking is the Industrial Revolution. It's nothing else. Don't kid yourselves. It's nothing else. It's capitalism. Surplus value equals death. Be clear about that. And it's industrialization, and rock and roll being an emanation of that is always about that. It's literally always about that. It's an expression of the thing, whether it takes it on or not. And now we look back on it, right? All of rock is now retrospective. All rock is now classic rock. And it's an emanation of that particular drive, but I'm hoping that the genres which have thankfully replaced it, and now we can see that rock and roll was an interesting lull between jazz and hip hop. And, it was an okay thing for people to do during that lull. We can locate it historically in that sense, but absolutely, it's never not in that context because it's all about industrialization.
I would add though that I think, I don't know, this is sort of making a leap, but I was just thinking about reading an interview with Valerie June, who was talking about the blues as a way of that when you hear pleasure in the blues or joy in the blues, it is a willful smile. It is a smile that defies despair. And I wonder if there's a similar willfulness to the freedom. Maybe there is an awareness, but it's like not exactly denial because it's awareness, but willful choice to live a mythos of being free, but not in denial. Or maybe I'm being too naive or idealistic in that.
I don't know. That's a tough one for me. I mean, I don't want to talk smack about rock and roll the whole time. Obviously, I'm of the age where rock and roll was a central part of my life for a meaningful portion of it. And like, you know, my relationship and my experiences are intense. And it's a little easy to say like, ah, rock and roll, boy, that was stupid. But I also don't want to, I mean, like the thing that you describe about the blues, and you quote Valerie Jean about it, like that's right and that's important. And it's much more knowing about it. Like it's like the blues relationship to a history of enslaved people singing, right? And plantation histories. It's very knowing about that and wanting to remain attached to it. Yeah. Rock and roll wants to detach from it. And there's something thrilling about that. But that desire to detach is a desire not to know. Yeah. I love rock and roll, but rock and roll is about wanting to not know. And that's not true of the blues.
Well said. Thank you, Joshua.
Yeah. Hi,
Ann. Before going to another question, I'm kind of tempted to ask Elizabeth, the rock and roll singer who we've asked here to talk about it today, whether she wants to weigh in on the rock part of this question.
Oh, I don't know if that's a very good idea. I don't want to take oxygen away from the conversation, but thank you. I'll have to think about that.
Okay, I just wanted to get the voice of a practitioner into the there hasn't been any rock since 1995 conversation. I think our next question is Ian Balfour. You there, Ian?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Joshua. So I'm speaking as a free/unfree man in Paris, and remembering fondly our seeing MIA live in Ithaca do her Roadrunner and you chanting along. So my question is, I was wondering in this writing a lot of pages about a very small object, if a small if rich object, if there were particular challenges about scale and mediation, like traditionally Marxist criticism has been good with big objects, you know, the historical novel, rise of the novel, genre, etc., and less good with small objects, with lyric poems. I mean, there's some good exceptions. So I was wondering if you could talk about like the difficulties or challenges or possibilities of moving from small to medium to big picture, from one level to another, for how you get from one sphere to another in writing this book.
Nice to see you, Ian. That's a complicated question, and I mean, Ian raises a bunch. You know, as in my speaking of wage labor, like my hypothetical wage labor is to be a Marxist literary critic, and Ian's right. Like I love poetry, and poetry has been handled much better by other kinds of critical traditions than Marxism. It's absolutely true. I don't deny this for a second. I didn't think of what I did in Roadrunner as particularly like Marxist method, like whatever. It's not all the brand. It's not Jamesonian or any of the brand names, but the categories that analysis of political economy gives me at production and circulation to start with have been really useful for me just to think about history. So the question for me was how to get from the small object, the song, to history big. And that's what I think what you mean by mediation. I didn't find it very hard because I was happy to leave the song behind pretty quickly and move to other songs. And as soon as I moved to other songs, it's not just that I'm building a bridge through history song to song, but I'm squaring off a historical period and starting to notice themes that develop across it. And that's more my wheelhouse. And I already know this has annoyed some people. They're like, wait a minute, this keeps on being about other things. Is that, for some people, they really wanted the book to be closer to a very long review of the song, which it's definitely not. The thing I'm interested in is not, in the end, the song. It's the world that makes the song have meaning and have meaning and like persist in its meaning and suggest change in its meaning. And that's the world. And so I took the chance to talk about the world and made my leap. And that, I think, for some people, they'll feel like there wasn't enough about the song. They wanted to know more about the song. They wanted to know more about how it's like Sister Ray. And they won't find that. I apologize for that.
Thanks.
I might step in here for a second because it spins off of that last question. Joshua, I think for the audience that we have here today, it might be nice if you describe a little bit about what you think the mandate for the series is, and what you guys are interested in books that look at songs, and how you think that's shaping up? I think that might be a good thing to have happen in the conversation. So maybe we'll do that now.
Yeah, I appreciate that prompt. I'm happy to talk about the series. And I know some of you might be interested in it. I'm also happy to talk about it with you offline. If people are curious about the series, and if they maybe want to pitch a song to the series, obviously you're all the sweet spot. That's why you're here. So you should feel welcome to maybe email me. I'm gonna put my email in the chat right now, just to make things easy. And you should feel free to email me, and I'll try and get back to you. I'm sometimes busy, but I'll do my best to get back to you. Yeah. So the mandate of the series, right, is to obviously it's books about single songs. I think for most people, the immediate comparator is the 33 1/3 series, probably for good reason. I think of them really differently myself. I think, an album, you probably can talk about just the album for an entire book, and a song you can't, right? A song you have to leave behind. A song you have to have a big story to set it in, or you can't get a book out of it. That said, people have approached that in really different ways. There's already like 3 or 4 books in progress, and more that are booked. More that are planned, and each one of them is different. So, for example, Chris Malamphy, who's here, who previewed some of the book he's working on at a previous iteration of this event. I think it's quite brilliant as a way to think about charts and how they work, which, I imagine that at least half the people here have spent their lives obsessed with, and you learn new things about that. And it's a real important thing, not just about sort of the technology of the music industry, but about how people understand genre, how people understand popularity, how people understand meaning in the context of measurement. And it does great things. Eric has written a draft that's been submitted to the series, and it's going out to readers. I'm confident it will be published, about Hound Dog and Big Mama Thornton, and it's not that. It's a dramatically different book. There's a different relationship to history that has to take on a series of questions. It overlaps in really interesting ways. I think there's really interesting questions about race and racialization, obviously. But so lots of things happen in the series, and I think there's lots of ways to approach it. They're short, right? They're long if you're a journalist. But they're short if you're a book writer. 30,000 words is not that much. I really struggled to figure out what was important to say and what was not to say. So I think it'll be different for people who are approaching it from the position of more journalism. It's going to be a really different approach from people who are used to writing 800-page books, figuring out what to leave out. But I'm happy to talk more about that, and people can email me there. I put my email in the chat.
Great, thank you, Joshua. Franklin Bruno has the next question, I think.
Hi, am I unmuted? Okay, so I'm not asking this question as a practitioner like Elizabeth also, but I preface it by saying that I always become very anxious when I have to formulate any remark or question to Joshua, so I apologize. But I'm kind of wondering, and there's no barb in this question, I'm just wondering what you'll say. Even in the paragraph that sort of introduces the book and in the email that we got sent, there's this mention of it's this song that lots of people know, but it wasn't ever a hit single. There's not really a canonical version, right? And you brought up in the ending passage you read Richman's own status as someone who has managed to blow up, not do quite what was expected of a rock career, and has remained a kind of cult artist with, as has come up in the chat, like peaks and valleys, times on periods on Sire, other well-distributed labels, other times not so much. So I'm kind of wondering about this cult status, this non-hit status, as a sort of not entirely successful commodity, and a rock star who doesn't ever have to sing about how awful it is to be on tour, and how that relates to your sort of categories of the pop commodity and how you see it. Because I think, you know, Jonathan Richman has been a big influence, and I'm wondering if you think a baleful one or a misinterpreted one on types of music, to coin a term, indie rock, that have often seen themselves as, that I think are largely about the self-deception about one's, whether one is a professional, whether one is making commodities, and they're actually often about limiting access to the commodity. So like, how does Jonathan and this music that you kind of against type really like, right, fit into that story for you? And is he to blame, or is he being misheard?
Wow. You know, I will admit right now, before I answer this, I mean, I appreciate that you said you're like anxious about formulating questions. I know you're very thoughtful. I know you're a trained philosopher, and so you're careful about these things. But I should just note, like, Franklin, who I've been in conversation with for a long time, absolutely like contributed to this book. Like, I had conversations with him about what counts as an original version of a song and things like that, contributed meaningfully to the book. There's other people here. Of course, Anne is cited in the book. Jody Rosen and I had really useful conversations. There's lots of people here whose thinking is in the book. And I want to say that now and appreciate that and respect that as I'm answering Franklin. For me, Franklin is in the book. And moreover, Franklin is such a likable person that even though he's an indie rocker, yeah, that's interesting. You there offer me a sociological knowledge I don't have, because I have not spent my life immersed in indie rock in any meaningful way. Or engaging with it, aside from to mostly be annoyed about it and occasionally find myself by surprise liking some of it. So I guess I don't even know that Jonathan is a big influence. I can see how he would be. As soon as you say it, I get it. But like sociologically, I just don't know that as a fact. But the thing I would say is, so indie rock is a very variegated and complex category, and in it there's people who are clearly desperate to like crank up their hairdo and be rock stars, and people who are perform self-abnegation and wanting to back, and all the things you talk about. I don't know of anyone who committed to the bit the same way that Jonathan Richman has. Now, that may seem dismissive to say he's committed to the bit, and I don't mean it that way. I mean, he really, being self-abnegating about being a commodity maker is not very interesting if you've never written a great song. But if you've written the greatest rock song of all time, which might be Roadrunner, I'm not sure. I got a list. Then at that point, withdrawing, you know, not withdrawing absolutely, he keeps on making songs, obviously, but, you know, Rimbaud kept writing poems. He didn't totally, but, you know, but he moved away, he left Africa. What he could have been, he decided not to be. And Rimbaud fucking committed to the bit. And Jonathan too. And I haven't encountered that so much in indie rock. I've just sort of encountered a kind of lifestyle around it or something. So I don't know, not sure.
Okay, Jody Rosen, do you want to ask your question? Is Jody still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Do I want to ask my question? I feel like Anne kind of got it. Well, I guess not. I asked Josh this question about, which I mentioned Joshua to you elsewhere, about in a different context, about lots of people dying in cars and the fact that the peak year for highway deaths in the United States was 1972. The year that Jonathan Richman wrote Roadrunner. So I was wondering if you want to address that context, wondering if they're in that this song of freedom and joy is also, is there a death wish hidden in it somewhere? And yeah, just, you know, like if you're driving faster miles an hour, a lot of people wind up wrapped around you know, a highway median when they do that. So I just was wondering about that social fact in the song.
Yeah, I mean, that was really useful when you raised that comment to me because I hadn't thought about it much. This is why you have smart friends, right? It's because you try and think of stuff and you don't think of everything. And then people will say, well, you should think about this. And you're like, yeah, I totally should. In the end, I think we didn't agree exactly, although I'm not sure you were pressing a point, which is say like, I don't think it's present in the song. I think it's notably unpresent in the song. It's not a possibility in the song's world. It's clearly a possibility in the world. And this maybe gets all the way back to Elizabeth's question about irony, which is the difference between like what you know and gets said and what you don't know or what doesn't get said, right? And so like, we know that any car going faster miles an hour with a teenager at the wheel, we know what it's subject to, and maybe we feel that risk, although that's just not my experience. I find Roadrunner unbelievably soothing and calming. Never more than Roadrunner Thrice, the 8.5-minute live version, which is just a lullaby. But even the fast versions, once and twice, I find incredibly calming. I don't feel the anxiety around it. And maybe that's the like interesting negative, right? Because if rock and roll is about forgetting, right, the bad thing, for me, the bad thing is wage labor, right? It's wage labor that has to be suppressed. It has to be the fact that you're also the factory worker, that's who you are. But you're also the person who dies in a car crash, just maybe not tonight. And maybe rock and roll is about obscuring that, except as you know very well, the long tradition of songs that are about really foregrounding that you know, reaches across many songs. The Mark Dinning, co-written with his sister, Teen Angel, the most extraordinary pathos-laden version one. Car Crash by the Avengers, my favorite one. It's a great tradition, but I think Jonathan's a different tradition that just totally suppresses that. But it's interesting what you hear and don't hear. You know, I was arguing with Griel about Maybelline and about, you know, the pivotal moment. That's when I heard that highway sound and the question of what that highway sound is. And Griel and I have really different versions of it. So I'm glad he's not here.
The end, but I want to squeeze one in, which is Adam Thirschwell's. Adam, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. It's kind of off track, the rest of the discussion, but I'm just interested in the you know, the musical side of Roadrunner, and it's all those questions I asked I'm not going to repeat what I wrote, but like there were others. It's a relationship to other songs, pop songs in 1972, 1973 that actually were on the radio. I mean, it's like it's that there's a sort of very antagonistic positioning, I think, and likewise just the history of its influence, like, and within Jonathan Richman's own personal history, the change in style. I mean, that sort of dramatic change in his sound after the first album. And I'd just be interested in hearing what you have to say about that. And I don't have any like more formulated version of what I'm looking for.
Well, I mean, I'm not. So first of all, pleasure to meet you close to in person. We were Facebook friends once upon a time. It's always amazing to like actually converse with people whom that's the case. Back when I was on Facebook, back in the 90s, when rock was still happening. I'm not sure I understand the first half of your question. And the second half is, I think, really crucial, because for me, it's a lot of what the book's about, right? He changes his style, in fact, before that first record comes out. By the way, read the chat. There's a considerable discussion of No Particular Place to Go in the book. But yeah, so he changes the style in the sort of the myth, like he has his own mythos, right? And in the mythos, he's got a residency in Barbados at the Inverurie Hotel, and here's the house band, and they're mellow and just like calm and soothing. And he's like, I want to do that. I don't want to be uptight and nervous making, and play like rock guitar. I want to be like soothing and like make people feel mellow. And that's before the first album is released, well before, in fact, and he changes the sound. And for me, that's the story I'm trying to narrate, is like, he narrates it as like how he wanted to make people feel, which is really interesting. I'm trying to re-narrate it or situate it in a different version, which is about choosing not to be a rock star. I think Roadrunner could have charted. It didn't chart in the US. It did chart in the UK. It could have charted if he'd released it when he recorded it and toured with it, and got it on the radio instead of releasing it like weirdly out of order, wrong version 4 years later, eventually a single in 77. He wrote it in 1970. Originally a single in, finally a single in 77 that has both versions on it. Like, of course it didn't chart, but it could have. And he could have been a rock star, and he could have kept that sound that would have been really compelling to people. Pablo Picasso and She Cracked and I'm Straight and all of that. And he was like, no, I don't want that to be my life. So part of it's about how it makes people feel, but part of it's about how he wants his life to be. And he says one of the great no's in the history of art. I think it's one of the most extraordinary no's in the history of art. And that's one of the things I'm trying to think through in the book. It's important to me and feels so powerful.
That seems like a great place to wrap up.